All right, so as I said, thanks for joining me. So we're going to go over today a handful of things, and basically what I've done is I've split this up to work on either nutritional things or habitual things. So rather than open this up and like everybody have their own individual super different questions, we're going to try and come up with some themes of things that we can work on. So the goals for this workshop is to come up with understand our most challenging nutritional hurdles. So just like kind of unpack them a little bit, then to categorize them, as I said, in between nutritional or habitual. So is it very specific to nutrition? Is it like how much protein should I be getting? Is it how big of a calorie deficit should I be creating? Or is it, hey, I have a tendency to overeat late at night. My environment encourages me to do X, Y, and Z. How can we change that? So that's more habitual. So the goal for today is we'll basically spend some time on the nutritional ones. So I got a handful of questions, I got a lot of questions from people online, and I tried to chunk them, the ones that I can answer today, into nutritional. So when it comes to the nutrition, we're going to try and identify the low-hanging fruit. So what are the actionable changes that we can make today, right now? What are the changes that you can take away and go and put it in your own specific kind of your own specific goal? So I want to make sure that you have a concrete takeaway, something that you can practice, something that you can do for the next however many days, weeks, whatever it takes to really understand your most difficult nutritional challenges and then work on them from there. So the three big questions that I kind of lumped together today were under nutrition. So for nutrition, the three big questions were: one, how much protein do I need? Two, should I eat less if I'm training less? And then the big one that kind of covers everything is how big of a calorie deficit should I be making if my goal is to continue to try and lose weight during this time. So let me start by saying trying to lose weight in this current environment is probably going to be more difficult than ever. And the likelihood is that if you've ever tried to lose weight in the past, you realize that it's quite tough. It is quite hard. You'll have to make some sacrifices, and being in a time of stress, it's a lot harder to do that this time around. So let me start by, as I said, saying that it might not be the best time for you to try and lose weight, but these strategies can be used long term. They can also be used to try and just maintain a healthy body weight at this point. So there's going to be some days when maybe we overeat, we overconsume, and there's going to be other days when we feel really good and we get to train for 2 hours and maybe we create a calorie deficit and we underconsume. So I just wanted to put kind of a disclaimer out there, and as I said, say that now might not be the best time to continue to try and really aggressively lose weight, especially in a stressful environment. But if you want to keep trying to do it, that's your prerogative, and I'm here to help. So they're the three big questions that I said. How much protein do I need? Should I eat less if I'm training less? And how big of a calorie deficit do I need to lose fat? Okay, and there's specifics through all of that. So let's talk a little bit about calories in versus calories out. That is the basic equation. You've probably read a million different things from a million different diets about calorie counting, not calorie counting, tracking your food, tracking your macros, all these different options. The simple math of it is, if you consume more calories than you burn, you'll store excess calories as body fat and you'll get heavier. Simple as that. Okay? Weight loss isn't necessarily the goal. So weight is just your relationship with gravity. So we're not trying to get lighter per se. That will be a byproduct of losing the body weight that we want to lose, the body fat that we want to lose. But just measuring yourself on the scale isn't necessarily the best option. But it's a good indicator to make sure that things are going down in the right direction. So calories in versus calories out in the vast majority of cases equals weight loss. So when I say the vast majority of cases, obviously there's some specifics, there's like hormonal imbalances and there are certain genetics that come into play, but they are a relatively small part, let's say less than 5% of the overall equation. If you consume more calories than you burn, you'll gain weight. If you burn more calories than you consume, you'll lose weight. Simple as that, okay? It's just a very simple energy equation. So let's focus on what we can control, right? So you can't necessarily control your hormones and you can't control your genetics, but what you can control, What you can control is the habits and the way that you shape your environment and the choices that you make. So we'll talk about those a little bit more specifically as we go through the rest of this. So the two big things that people end up talking about, or people end up having questions about, are number one, what does nutrient density mean? And number two, what does calorie density mean? So nutrient density, very simple, describes the amount of nutrition or the good stuff that you can obtain from a given food. All right, so the good stuff that you can get from that food. Calorie density, simply the amount of calories or the amount of energy, the necessary stuff that you can get from a given food. Okay, so you've probably heard the phrase before, and if you haven't, this is new for you, great, that not all calories are created equal, and that's true. You know, if I was to eat 500 calories worth of chicken breast and 500 calories worth of Pop-Tarts, they're going to do different things for me. Also, specifically, if I eat them at different times of day, if I eat them during my training session, they're all going to kind of have different effects for me. So I don't need to tell you, I don't think, what to eat, because most of us know what to eat. We know that more vegetables than Cheetos is probably a better option. We know that we should probably eat more unprocessed food than we should over-processed food. Like they're pretty simple things for us to understand, so I'm not going to sit here today and tell you all the best options for food, because my estimation is that everybody I've ever worked with typically knows what the best options for those foods are, but how we blend them together and when we use them is what makes it really specific to us. So nutrient density and calorie density. Nutrient density, the amount of nutrition or the good stuff, the things that kind of help us work, we can obtain from a given food. And then calorie density, the amount of total calories that we can get from a given food. All right. So as we move on here, we're going to keep talking to a little bit more about calories in versus calories out. So the first question that we're going to address here is, should I eat less if I'm training less? It depends on your goal. All right. As I said right at the very start of this, if your goal is to maintain your body weight, be able to do the things that you want to do and not feel stressed and kind of hungry, and keep trying to lose weight in this time of high stress, then no, you can eat the same amount of calories that you would usually do, but understand that if you eat a calorie surplus, so you eat more calories than you burn, then the likelihood is that at some point you're going to see that scale go up, you're going to gain weight that maybe you don't want. Okay. The opposite is also true. If you can make a small deficit, no matter how small it is, you're going to gradually chip away at that body weight that you're looking to try and drop. So why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because even though we're healthfully minded, so we're eating healthy food, we're very conscious of eating healthy food, for the most part anyway. Chicken wings are still chicken wings and Pop-Tarts are still Pop-Tarts. And they're delicious any time of the year. But understand that healthy food still has calories. So even if your intention is to eat healthy food, it doesn't mean that you can just go bonkers on it. So my father-in-law, for example, measures love in food, and he always says like, well, it's whole wheat. That doesn't mean I can eat a whole loaf of it. Or it's whole milk. Well, that doesn't mean I can drink a whole gallon of it. It still has those calories. Yes, from a nutrient standpoint, it's still it's very nutrient dense, like they're the best options for me, but it's also still got calories in it. There's still a particular calorie density to it, so it doesn't mean that I can just consume more good stuff. More is not better, better is better. So it's not all about eating low calorie foods or only about eating healthy foods. What we're trying to do is find a balance, right? We're trying to find a balance because we can't just live eating low calorie foods that we don't like. If you've ever tried that before, you'll know that it's pretty futile, and after about 5 days, you'll be miserable and you'll reach for the thing that makes you feel happy regardless of how many calories is in it. So that's kind of yo-yo dieting at its best. So the goal is to find a sweet spot between the foods that you like and the foods that serve you in terms of your energy, so it like supports your output, your health goals, whether it's to get stronger, lose weight, and also just to maintain your life, like maintain you as a human being. Like if you only eat protein, you're going to be pretty low on energy and you're probably going to have pretty poor digestion, pretty poor absorption. Like, yeah, there's still enough calories in that thing, but you need a good blend of the macronutrients across the board. Okay, so in terms of should I eat less calories if I'm training less, it depends on the goal, obviously. But if your goal is to continue to try and lose weight, yes. However, make sure that you're getting the right balance of carbohydrates, fats, and protein. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But make sure that you're getting the right balance of those things. It's not just about eating healthy food or low calorie foods. We're trying to find that blend of, as I said, the most nutrient dense foods that still support us in our output, whilst not just eating celery and broccoli and things that aren't that delicious on their own, and finding a way that we can blend them together. So, as I said, not just about eating foods we don't like. So the next question was, as we move on to it, and we'll kind of try and blend all these together, but like, how much protein do I need? So that's pretty specific, and it's pretty specific depending on what you do on a day-to-day basis. So the person who asked me this, I know that she's pretty active, and I know the age range that she's in, I know what she does and how long she trains. So on the upper echelon, we can be in a gram of protein per pound of body weight per day, and that can pretty much always stay the same. If you're training regularly, like that's that. Sorry, it told me I got kicked off. So yeah, that's the higher portion. A gram of protein per pound of body weight per day. So you can do the math there as to how many calories that builds out to and how many calories you get to eat of protein per day. So there's 4 calories per gram of protein. Simple as that. So if you eat 100 grams of protein, you get 400 calories. All right, simple as that. And then you just extrapolate out from there, give or take. Like we'll try. It's not perfect math, but let's say give or take. So it's making sure that I'm going to it here. So when it comes to the amount of protein that you can eat on a daily basis, that's a good place to start. If you can eat a little bit less, that's fine. But the first thing we'll talk about when it comes to the macros is getting enough protein. So why do we talk about protein? Like, I'm really not that bothered about where you get your protein from. If you're vegetarian, if you rely more so on shakes, if you rely more so on protein bars, you know, obviously I have my preferences, but to begin with, when it comes to getting enough protein in, aim for that total amount, and then we can gradually shift away at getting the protein from the right places over time. I wouldn't say just live on Quest bars, because digestively that's probably going to give you some issues, but just work on getting enough protein to begin with, okay? So the macronutrient of protein is the first place I'll go, because for the most part, if our goal is to still try and lose weight or at least maintain athletic output, muscle is what's going to do that. And if we eat enough protein, we're going to support muscle function, we're going to support muscle repair, and we're going to support a little bit of energy as well. So it's a good place to start by getting enough protein in your diet. So anywhere in between 0.8 and a gram of protein per pound of body weight a day is pretty high on the athletic range. But if I see how many people that are clicking in here on these links, it's, you know, mostly athletic people who are training an hour a day. So it's a good place to start. So moving on from there, we're now going to talk a little bit more about what's the magic number in terms of creating the calorie deficit. So creating the calorie deficit is, you know, again, it depends on what your goal is, but it's a simple math equation. But the simple math equation really comes down to, it's a simple math equation on the superficial layer, but if I create too big of a calorie deficit, I'm gonna struggle, and here's why, all right? So I'll try to do my very best here to layman's this out. So if our muscles are made of protein, all right, protein is an energy source, the same as carbohydrates and the same as fat. Carbohydrates are typically our preferred energy source when we train, when we do any kind of athletic output. Right? They're easy to break down. We can get them in lots of different sources, and they're readily available. So we can use those first. So any person who ends up going on a low calorie diet or a low carb diet typically sees a pretty big drop off if they're going from a high or moderate carbohydrate diet into a lower one. Typically sees a pretty big drop off to begin with until they adjust to eating low carbs. Carbohydrates are necessary. They're not don't vilify them. Certain types of carbohydrates can be a little bit more useful. You know, a banana is not the same as a Snickers. They're going to do different things for us. But carbohydrates are not to be vilified, right? Certain types of carbohydrates, as I say, can be better or worse for us depending on what we do. So carbohydrates are necessary, and I would say get 30 to 40% of your calorie intake, if you're athletic, calorie intake on a day-to-day basis from carbohydrates. And then where we break them up, if we have them pre-workout, we're probably going to get a bit more energy and we're going to be able to do more output. But to go back to, if we start eating more protein. So protein supports muscle. Our muscles are made of protein. If we don't eat enough total calories, our body has to go to what it's got in reserve. And the simple fact is that our body will go and choose the easy thing to break down first. And in an ideal world, that's fat. But this is not an ideal world, as we're currently finding out. So the easiest thing for us to break down, the easiest thing for my energy systems to break down is actually my muscle, all right? So that's the protein. If I don't eat enough protein, I'm not going to support muscle growth, and before I know it, that muscle is going to get a little bit smaller, a little bit smaller, a little bit smaller, okay? So if I just don't eat enough protein, my body's going to go to muscle for an energy source and start breaking it down. Carbohydrates is the next most important macronutrient in my opinion, or not in my opinion, but my opinion and experience, which says that muscle or the protein, that's where the carbohydrate lives. Now, if I don't get enough carbohydrates in it to support my output, again, it's going to start chipping down and it's going to start using protein. Fat is ultimately one of the last things to go. So when it comes to eating enough carbohydrates and eating enough protein, carbohydrates and fat are great energy sources. They go to the muscle. If we only put a little bit in them, or if we only fill them up maybe 75%, our body feels pretty comfortable using carbohydrates and fat together. But if we don't get enough total calories in, our body will just start breaking down the muscle. So not only does that leave us burning the stuff that we want to keep, but it also reduces our ability to be able to fill, if that muscle's this big, I can fit X amount of carbohydrates in it. Now, as that muscle gets smaller, I can fit less carbohydrates in it. I can fit less energy in it. So not only do I get to do less, but I also now get to eat less. So as my muscles get smaller, I've got to be okay with eating less food, which is pretty difficult. And then before we know it, from a superficial level, we are getting lighter on the scale, but we're ultimately looking a little softer. We're ultimately not looking as full. Those muscles aren't as full because we're not able to maintain their size, and we're using that muscle, we're breaking it down for protein to use it as energy, okay? So it's not about training 3 hours a day and eating as few calories as possible. There has to be a balance. There has to be a little chip away at each piece in order for us to be able to maintain our muscle mass and burn a little bit of body fat. Because our body's not stupid. It will hold on to the thing that it values the most, and what it values the most is the highest caloric output, and that's fat. So it's just going to hold on to that and break down the stuff that's easier to break down, and that's protein or carbohydrates. But if you're not eating any carbohydrates, protein goes next. So making sure that we get enough protein in first, 30 to 40% of our daily calories coming in through protein, and then making sure that after that we get enough carbohydrates to support our output. And then fat is the last thing. And the fat's the last thing because it's a decent energy source. It helps absorption, it helps cell function, but it's also the highest caloric amount per gram. So if you eat a thumb-sized amount of carbohydrates, you get X amount of calories. If you eat a thumb-sized amount of fat, you probably get maybe 2.5 times the same calories. So fat's the first thing to go when it comes to like chipping away at our overall total calories because it's the low-hanging fruit in that respect. Okay, so what's the magic number then? The magic number in terms of being able to create a calorie deficit is about 10 to 20% of what your current basal metabolic rate is. So basal metabolic rate, just something that supports your daily output. So for me, if I was to train an hour a day, I'd probably burn about 500 calories, and then the rest of my daily functions probably worth about 20 to maybe 2,000 calories. So my total daily output with an hour of training, my body needs 2,500 calories to sustain its body weight. So if I was going to create a calorie deficit, I'd want to maybe chop 10 to 20% away there. So that's 250 to 500 calories. Any more, and I start doing what we just talked about with the muscle, which is I start chipping away at the muscle, which lowers its capacity to burn energy later on. It lowers its capacity to be able to look good and do stuff later on. It just gets smaller. So 10 to 20% is a great place to start. 20% is pretty difficult. If you're trying to burn 500 calories extra, create a 500 calorie deficit a day, that's pretty hard. So you'll have to start by trying to find what your total amount of calories to be able to support your daily function is anyway. If you've got, a fitness tracker, it's a great place to start. If not, there's plenty of online kind of estimators for that. You put in your age, your body weight, your activity level, and it'll give you a number. And you can start tweaking from there. So there is no magic number necessarily, but a good place to start is in between 10 and 20%. And as I said, you likely have a rough understanding of what it already takes to sustain your body, kind of your output. You know when you feel uncomfortable because how hungry you are. You've probably got some good indicators there as to how, what's telling you I can eat more or I shouldn't eat more. So that's about creating the right size deficit. How do we create that deficit? Well, make sure that we're making smart food choices. So remember, there's no perfect foods. Some people will like to eat high carb, low protein. Some people will prefer to eat high fat, low carb. It doesn't necessarily make that much of a difference, providing you're getting a blend of all three. If you're just cutting out carbohydrates, you're not going to last very long. It's just a fact. If you've ever just stopped trying to eat bread or cut out all sugar, you've probably felt crap and it's lasted you 10 days before you've gone back in the opposite direction. So trying to go cold turkey and cut out one major macronutrient is not going to work for you. Having said that, getting a blend of different carbohydrates in there. So maybe you respond really well to oats or rice, or maybe you don't. So maybe you have to find, you have to go to potatoes, or you have to go to beans or some other grain where you can get that same level of like consistent energy, but it's still coming from carbohydrates. Bread isn't the only carbohydrate. Pizza isn't the only carbohydrate. It's the things that make up pizza and bread that is carbohydrates. So thinking about things from like a single ingredient food is a great place to start. And then you can start building meals out a little bit with that. So remember, there's no perfect foods, but a good place to start is single ingredient foods. So it's like having a cake, I guess. Like you can have eggs, you can have water, you can have flour. Once you put them together, you don't really know how much eggs, water, and flour you've had in there now. But if you just keep the individuals and put them together on a plate, you know that you've got all these specifics that are still available to you. So in terms of finding the right foods that match those macronutrients, as I said earlier on, I would advise as a good place to start is somewhere in the middle. So getting 30 to 40% of your daily calories from carbohydrates, and depending on what you get, 30 to 40% of your daily calories from protein, but prioritize protein first because that's what's going to sustain muscle function. This is assuming that you're training to a decent intensity level each day, or doing some level of activity 3 to 5 days per week. That's a good place to start as well. So maybe burning 400 to 500 calories for an hour. That's a great place to be. These assume that you're a relatively athletic population. So 30 to 40% of calories from carbohydrates or protein, and then the rest is made up from fat. So it's about 30% made up from fat. They're, again, pretty good blends to go across. In order to break those out, you'll have to do a little bit of math. There's plenty of online calorie calculators that can tell you, like MyFitnessPal is a great place to start. If you just stick chicken breast in MyFitnessPal, if you go to the analytics of that, it'll tell you where the calories come from. Estimated how much fat is in a chicken breast, estimated how much protein and carbohydrates in a chicken breast. So begin to start doing a little bit of research on those, and putting your most popular and most common foods into something like that will give you a great kind of understanding, or a better understanding of where your calories are coming from. If you don't want to count calories, however, and I'll send this out as like a PDF or just as an infographic, if you don't want to count calories, you have a perfect calorie counter right here. It's on the end of your wrist. It's called your hand. And then in terms of, this is very, very simple. It's very crude, but it's a great place to start. In terms of getting enough food, a palm of protein for women per meal, 2 palms of protein for men per meal. A fist of vegetables for women per meal, 2 fists of vegetables for men per meal. Carbohydrates, it's like a cupped hand, 1 to 2 handfuls depending on whether you're training, and that's the same for men and women. You can always probably eat a little bit more carbs or a little bit more vegetables. And then when it comes to fat, it's a thumb's worth of fat for women per meal, 2 thumbs of fat for men per meal. So it depends on what that looks like. Like that could, at breakfast could look like peanut butter. At lunch, it could look like avocado. It could look like whatever you want it to look like. Go for single ingredient foods. And then that's a good place to start if you're not interested in counting calories for whatever reason. You know, there's plenty of pros and cons to counting calories. On one hand, it's very specific. On the other hand, it can make you a little neurotic. So if you know where your tendencies lie in that respect, you could start there. So there should be, hopefully, there's a handful of things that you can take away from this. Whether you are just trying to work out how many total calories you're trying to burn on a day-to-day basis, how much protein you're trying to eat on a day-to-day basis, or what's the blend of macronutrients you can eat on a day-to-day basis, or if, you know, an alternative to calorie counting. All those things have kind of been covered here. So hopefully there's a handful of things for you to take away. This one was very specific around nutrition, very specific around working on trying to understand what it is that goes into building a good meal or a bad meal, or not a bad meal necessarily, but building into an efficient meal or a less efficient meal. Next week, what we're going to try and do is go over more habitual stuff. So I know for me, for example, I have a tendency to overconsume certain foods at certain times of the day. So it's trying to set up some checks and balances in that time of day and trying to kind of spitball some ways that I can avoid overeating those foods. So my prime example is I eat a lot. I have a tendency to eat chocolate late on in the evening. So I actually keep my chocolate in the trunk of the car so that when I'm in the house, I have to make a conscious decision to go out to the car and get it. And that's my checks and balances. It kind of draws my attention to it. So there's lots of different ways that we can frame our environment when we try and work on our habits like that. So I'm going to pose more questions to people. The question will be very specific to what type of food do you overconsume and when. And then so start thinking about those examples as to what types of food you overconsume, when you typically overconsume them, and how we can go about adjusting those. And then next week, what we'll talk about, as I said, is to kind of come up with some checks and balances of how we can maximize eating good food and minimize our bad habits, or maximize our good habits, minimize our good habits, with relation to our nutrition choices. So I will send out a link for all my notes for today, and you can follow along with it. I've recorded it as well. So I'll put it up on YouTube and I'll send it out to everybody that's been on here. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you all have a great day.